Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. We are your hosts and hopefully your new bookish pals. I'm Hannah MacDonald.
And I'm Lydia Clare. It's so great to have you back for another instalment in our debut Spotlight series, where we shine the light on the freshest new authors and their work. Today we go back in time to ancient Greece to meet Clytemnestra, a mother, a monarch and a murderer, in an epic historical retelling of one of history's forgotten female icons.
Costanza Casati is a freelance journalist and screenwriter. Born in Texas in 1995, she then grew up in a village near Milan in Italy. She attended a classical liceo where she studied ancient Greek and ancient Greek literature for 5 years. Costanza is a graduate of the prestigious Warwick Writing MA program where she studied under writer Sarah Moss. Costanza's short stories have appeared in Nothing in the Rule Book and have been broadcast on Raw 1251 Warwick Radio. And she's written and produced documentaries for Italian television. She's here joining us today about her debut novel, Clytemnestra, which was published by Michael Joseph, an imprint of Penguin, on the 2nd of March. So Costanza, welcome to A Pair of Bookends.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Oh, we're so excited to have you.
I was about to say, you don't understand how excited I am to actually talk to you. I feel like I've been living in your book. I feel like I'm partly in your brain right now because of how much I've loved this book.
Yeah, it's amazing and kind of creepy as well, but I love it.
Oh, yeah, right? Full on, but I'm going for it. I would just like to ask you before we get into the book, what are you currently reading?
That's a great question. I am currently reading 3 things. I actually have them here. I'm reading Cleopatra and Frankenstein by Coco Mellors. I think you probably have seen this because it's everywhere.
Yes.
It was recently Waterstone's Book of the Month. It's amazing. It's a love story between Cleo, who's a 24-year-old woman, and Frank, who's 20 years older than her. They marry kind of impulsively because Cleo needs a visa. And it's just their love story, but also it's about how their love story affects all the people around them. And that's my favorite part of the novel. And I think Pandora Sykes described it as very tender, very funny, but also quite heartwarming. And I think that's just the perfect way of describing the book. I'm also reading Jenny Saint's new retelling. It's called Atalanta, and it's about the only female Argonaut. I think I just love the way she writes about ancient Greece. She has a very, very different way from my own writing, I would say, but it's just very mythical rather than historical fiction. It works so well. And then I am reading the scripts of Fleabag.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. Also, where have you got that cover from? Because that is beautiful.
It was a gift from a friend, and I'm enjoying this so much, honestly. It's just like watching the TV series. It's amazing. I highly recommend it. And it's like a masterclass in writing dialogue. It's so good.
Oh, I loved Fleabag so much. Yeah, I need to go rewatch it. Lydia's rewatched it about 4 times.
Yeah. I probably could quote to you quite a bit of those scripts. But yeah, so it's just a masterpiece.
It is actually a masterpiece.
Yeah, that's true.
And Costanza, can you join us every week for book club? Because that selection of books is probably the best roundup we've had from an author.
I would love that. Love that. That's all I do, write and talk about books.
I love it.
No social life. No, I'm kidding. I have friends.
Oh, no, I love it. You are definitely welcome week in, week out with those recommendations. I am waiting for Lydia to read Cleopatra and Frankenstein.
Literally next.
Yeah, I'm waiting very impatiently.
I think you will love it. If you like Sally Rooney, you will love this one. It has its own voice, but it also has some similar themes. So it's great.
Lovely.
And Lydia's a Waterstones bookseller herself, so it's just really poor effort, Lydia.
I am. Don't tell my boss that I didn't read the book of the month.
And I said that it was Waterstone's Book of the Month. I was like, oops. You know.
You've dropped her in it. No, you've dropped her in it.
Yeah. Sorry.
It's all right. He knows.
So we are obviously so pleased to have you, and we are having you as part of our debut Spotlight series. Now, we've been starting off these episodes by asking our authors what your journey has been like into having your debut published. So could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So I always find it quite interesting when the authors say that it just happened to them, like writing just happened to them. Because I've always known that I want to be an author, like ever since I was old enough to want anything. But it was more of a dream than just like an actual attainable goal. But I grew up in Italy, and I think that's also why I just saw it as a kind of dream. So I had two challenges, I think. One, the actual challenge of getting published, which is incredibly hard. And the other was that I was writing in my second language. And it was not necessarily like a challenge in itself, because I started writing in Italian when I was really young. I was about 11 or 12. And then I switched to English when I moved to England. So I was like 18, 19. And I was writing in English, so I knew that I could do it. But I think it was more of a challenge in the sense that I didn't know anyone who was writing in English as like a second language. And I think in that respect, reading anything that Elif Shafak has ever written has been hugely inspirational for me, not only because I'm a huge fan of anything she writes, also because she talks a lot about what it means to write in your second language. Well, she writes both in Turkish and in English, which I think is just phenomenal. Like now, I don't think I could switch back to Italian now, but I remember reading an interview of hers where she says that distance sometimes can bring you closer to something, that sometimes when you step out of something, you just see the thing better in a way. And that really resonated with me. And so I think it just gave me a lot of, like, seeing someone like her gave me a lot of confidence in terms of actually, getting an agent and being published. But in terms of like with Clytemnestra specifically, I started writing a book, I think 6-7 years ago now. And I was doing my master's, and I was doing my master's in creative writing. And I had a module that was called historical fiction, fictional histories. And I started writing Clytemnestra story then. And then I had, I think about like just 50 pages. I knew I wanted it to be a novel, but I had to stop for a while because I moved back to Italy for a few years and worked in television as a like producer and freelance screenwriter. And then I wrote most of the novel during lockdown. And then I had this moment when I had to submit to agents, and I was like, this is it. This is the moment. I had been rejected before. I had been writing like short stories. I had been sending them for like literary competitions, but most of them got rejected. And I think I always love when authors talk about rejection, because it's such a huge part of our job, and we should just talk about it more and more. But I think being rejected really, well, it didn't really help with my confidence. But I think when you get to that point, when you just keep going, even though you keep getting rejected, it just like, it does something to you, and it just helps you becoming, I don't know, just not confident, but I don't know, more determined in a way. And when I started submitting, to agents, I just realized that I didn't know how to pitch my own novel. And I mean, I had done a creative writing course, but no one had ever taught me how to submit. How to write an elevator pitch, which is something that's still incredibly useful to me, or just how to write a synopsis, which is the most traumatizing thing ever. I mean, my book is almost 500 pages and I had to write a 1-page synopsis. That's just really hard. And so I just took a little course, like an online course from Curtis Brown. I actually always recommend those courses to anyone who wants to just write novels, because they're really, really helpful. And I just learned how to pitch my own novel, and then I submitted to agents, and I had like my dream agent, which is now she's my actual agent, but at the time I thought she was kind of unattainable. And so she was the last one I actually submitted to, because I wanted to have some manuscript requests first. And then it worked. I got a few rejections, a few manuscript requests, told my now agent that I got those requests, and she also requested the manuscript, and then I just signed with her. But it's been, sometimes people think that because I'm young, this happened very quickly, but it's been a long time coming. And yeah, that's my journey, publishing.
Amazing. It's so exciting. And I said before in your intro that you studied under the writer Sarah Moss.
I did, yeah.
How was that? Because I love Sarah Moss.
Love Sarah Moss, yeah. So that was actually the course, the module I mentioned before, historical fiction, fictional histories. She taught that. She and another writer, a historical fiction author called Tim Leach, who's also amazing. And she was amazing, very encouraging, and she's someone who believes in just writing and rewriting and just deleting draft after draft, which is something that I can't do personally. I edit as I write, but I think she was fantastic in the sense that she encouraged each author to find his or her own approach. And that's something that was very invaluable advice to me. So
amazing. And then you've brought this incredible book to us. So, thank goodness, even though you said that you've had rejections, thank goodness that you kept going, because
how this book could ever be rejected? No,
honestly.
I think it was because obviously it's such a, like, Greek mythology is having like such a huge moment now. It's a big trend. And at the time, I was submitting back in 2021. I think some agents believed that the market was too crowded, and others told me that I was doing something that was too different from all the other retellings, which I thought was a strength, because obviously you don't want to like do what other people are doing. But I think they were kind of scared that maybe it just wouldn't work, because obviously I was writing in third person, I was writing in present tense, I was writing something that was more, as I said before, historical fiction rather than just mythical retelling. It didn't have any magical elements in it. And I think people were just worried that they didn't know how to sell it right in a way. But it's just about finding the right agent, really. So yeah, it all worked out.
And that's it. It only takes one yes. That's all it takes.
That's so true. That is so true. That's what I kept telling myself 2 years ago.
This is what we do. This is what we do as creatives. We just wait for that yes. I mean, I'd never heard of Clytemnestra's story before this. I don't even know how to say her name. Can you tell us a bit more about the inspiration for the story and about her character?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said before, I grew up in Italy and I attended this, let's call it classical high school, which is basically a high school where classics are compulsory. So you study ancient Greek and Latin for 5 years, and you start studying ancient Greek language and literature when you're only 14 years old. So it's pretty intense. So I was kind of familiar with the Greek myths because of that kind of background. But specifically, I became familiar with the character Clytemnestra when I was about 16, 17, and because we were studying the ancient Greek plays, the ancient Greek tragedies. And I immediately fell in love with her. I immediately thought that Clytemnestra was the standout character from the Greek myth, because she's a very ancient character, but also a very modern woman. As I always say, she's someone who refuses to submit. And I think the first time I encountered her, I was she's mentioned in the Odyssey, which is the epic journey of the hero Odysseus as he tries to go back home after the Trojan War. And she's just a passing mention in the Odyssey. She's not like an actual character, but she's mentioned when Odysseus goes to the underworld and meets Agamemnon, who was Clytemnestra's husband and whom was murdered by Clytemnestra as soon as he got back from the Trojan War. This is why Clytemnestra is famous for being this kind of lustful murderess. That's how she's been remembered for years, for centuries, really. And so in the Odyssey, Odysseus and Agamemnon meet in the underworld, and Agamemnon calls Clytemnestra monstrous. He calls her bestial. He calls her deadly. So the very first time she's mentioned in the kind of Western literary tradition, she is this kind of, as I said, very tormented murderess. But then she takes center stage in this play, which is what I studied all those years ago, and that's what made me fall in love with Clytemnestra. And the play is called Agamemnon, even though Clytemnestra is actually the main character, was written by Aeschylus. And in this play, Clytemnestra is just an extraordinary heroine. First of all, she is incredibly powerful. She's a ruler. She has been ruling, when we meet her in the play, she has been ruling the city of Mycenae for 10 years. And Mycenae in ancient Greece was the most powerful city. This period in history sometimes is called Mycenaean Greece, after the city of Mycenae. So she was really the most powerful city of ancient Greece. She's also someone who is very cunning, very clever, very articulate. If you read the play, every confrontation that she has with her husband or the elders, who are kind of the counselors of the king or queen, she always outclasses them. She always outsmarts them. There's a point in the play when she paints this picture of herself as a kind of lonely, wretched woman who wanted to commit suicide many times while her husband was away, which we know isn't true. She just knows how to use her words. And she's also someone who is incredibly unapologetic. And that is my favorite thing about her. She just doesn't care about what other people think of her, which is not only extraordinary for like a modern woman, but also like specifically in the Greek heroic age. It's just incredible. And so when I was reading the play, all those things that I just listed made me want to write about her. And I think it was Madeline Miller who once wrote that Clytemnestra is every storyteller's dream. And I just could not agree more, because the fact that she's powerful, scandalous, cunning, all those things make her, I always say that all those things make her the embodiment of men's fears and anxieties towards powerful women. And that's the topic that I just really love exploring.
She is an incredible character. And I was just completely blown away by this book. I think I speak for both me and Lydia that we don't really, or haven't really delved into many myth retellings. I think this was the first for me. So I was very nervous going into it, but this is my favorite read of the year. And I know we're into March, but like this is going to be on my top books of the year. Like it's so incredible. And I just think the way that you explore the disparities, I guess, in sort of societal perceptions and treatment between like men and women, it's sort of like, it's a tale as old as time, isn't it? And I'm just so in awe, like how it just felt so relevant, even now, I was just completely blown away. Obviously, you wrote the book in part, you split the novel into parts, and we track as readers Clytemnestra throughout various ages in her life and sort of all the trials and tribulations that she experiences. Why was it important for you to split the novel into these parts and to track her life in this way?
It's really, really important. Actually, before I answer the question, I just loved that you said that this was your first myth retelling, because I always say that I wrote this both for people who are kind of familiar with the Greek myths and who maybe are classicists and will pick up on like references to the ancient texts. But I really wanted to make sure that this was a novel for people who maybe didn't know anything about these stories and didn't know anything about these myths, because that's just something that I love reading myself. I love just opening a novel where I don't know anything about the background or the setting, and I just learn something new. And this whole idea of like reading a book and learning as you're reading without realizing that you're actually learning, I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it's just like one of the best things about reading in general. So I'm just glad that it worked for you, even if it was your first kind of retelling. But yeah, in terms of splitting the novel into 5 parts, well, originally it was split into 3 parts to kind of mimic the ancient Greek plays. But I really wanted to make sure that I was following her from her time as a young woman in Sparta, as a Spartan princess, up to her ascent to power in the city of Mycenae. And this was because I think most of the time the Greek myths are told separately when actually they're all connected. And it's something that's one of my favorite things about the Greek myths, that they're kind of a big tapestry where each thread is just connected to, like each story is like a thread connected to all the others. And I really wanted to convey that in the novel, to just bring together different myths, different famous characters. Obviously, Clytemnestra remains the protagonist throughout. This is her story. But I was interested in showing readers how she's actually connected to, her brothers, obviously, but they're not usually mentioned. Her brothers, Castor and Polydeuces, were twins and who were Argonauts. They were part of this band of heroes who went in search of the Golden Fleece. They obviously are connected to Clytemnestra's story. Obviously, Helen's story and the fact that she causes the Trojan War is connected to Clytemnestra's. I wanted to show how Clytemnestra is kind of bound to the hero Odysseus through her own cousin Penelope. So I think on the one side, I was interested in showing this. On the other, I think most of the time with these retellings, what they do wonderfully is that they retell a specific myth. And so they tell like a specific part of a character's life. Whereas I wanted to explore her whole life, because her story is so tricky. You're writing about a character who kills her own husband, obviously. And if you don't show the readers why, if you don't go back in time, then it's going to be really hard for your readers to root for a character. And my goal was to kind of reclaim her reputation, to make sure that you see a character doing some bad things, but that you always kind of root for her, even though sometimes she's unlikable, even though sometimes she can be cruel. But I wanted to show all the different facets of her. I wanted the readers to kind of fall in love with her in a way. And I had to start at the very beginning. And I also like this idea of exploring how vengeance and obsession can change a person, all the kind of negative effects of vengeance, of obsession. And there was a moment when I was just editing the novel, I remember, and I kept putting a scene from her like childhood next to a scene from her time in Mycenae. And it was very interesting for me to see how different she becomes. And there's a scene in the novel when she says, once decency, courage, goodness came easily to her, now it is just lies. I'm actually paraphrasing my own novel. That's not how it goes, but you know which scene I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And she's become a completely different person. And for me, it was important to show how she gets there and why she becomes this kind of person.
You just made me remember that perfect first page that I've been seeing everybody that reads Clytemnestra take photos of this page.
The opening poem, you mean? Yeah.
Yes. Could you read us that first page? Because I just think it's so beautiful.
Yeah. So as we said before, the novel is split into 5 different parts, and each part is introduced either by like a little poem that I wrote, by like drawing from the ancient sources, or a line from the ancient Greek that I translated. And this is like a little poem that I wrote. And it's obviously about female power and ambition, which is like one of the main themes of the novel. There is no peace for a woman with ambition, no love for a woman with a crown. She loves too much. She's lustful. Her power is too strong. She's ruthless. She fights for vengeance. She's mad. Kings are brilliant, mighty, godlike. Queens are deadly, shameless, accursed.
So good. And that, listeners, is why you need to pick this book up. I had no idea that you wrote that. I mean, I've read it back earlier and I was like, okay, so it's nobody's been quoted here, but I was trying to like Google like specific lines, like where has this come from? I didn't know it'd come from, obviously it's come from your brain. I mean, come on. But it is just, that is incredible. And as soon as I read that, I was like, okay, I'm in for a treat here. Like, I just knew I was going to love it.
You just know in that moment that this is going to be something special.
100%.
This is actually the last thing I ever wrote. This was not in my first, second, or third draft.
Wow.
Because as I said before, the novel was split into 3 different parts before, and the parts were not introduced by any particular quote. And then as I realized that it actually, like, the structure needed to be different, I needed 5 parts instead of 3. I had the 4th part was introduced by letters already because I had written those letters. And then I had 2 quotes that I really, really loved. And so I used those to introduce part 2 and 5. And then I was like, I should just write something myself. I don't usually write poetry. I was like, I'll go for it. And then it took me like a whole week to get this right.
It was worth the effort.
It really is. It's gorgeous. I love it so much. And I feel like it really summarizes how throughout history men are labeled, as you say, brilliant, mighty, godlike. And then it's the women that they're lustful, they're ruthless, they're mad. It's just all these like negative connotations. And I feel like Clytemnestra is your book. I mean, Clytemnestra is just a total reclaiming of that narrative and definitely reclaiming of her story, because, you know, when I've looked up Clytemnestra's story after reading this book, it is just saying that, you know, she's the wife of Agamemnon, she's the daughter of da-da-da, she belongs to these men rather than being her own individual being. And I think you get that so much throughout history. There's all these women and their name is just attached to men, and it's just, she's actually got so much going for her without any of these men in the picture.
Absolutely. I think so much of this novel is about ownership and about taking ownership. And I feel like Clytemnestra takes control of what she can do in her own life. Like anything that she can get a hold of, a grip of, she's going to do it because she needs to take that ownership for herself. It's so interesting the way that her personality works in that way. What was it about Clytemnestra's place in the world that you wanted to explore with this book?
That's a great question. I think actually also following something that you said before, this idea of, you know, this contrast between how men are perceived, how women are perceived, that was something that I definitely wanted to explore, because not just in general how modern that concept is, but specifically in ancient Greece, I think something that is very interesting is how heroism is perceived, because the ancient Greeks didn't have an idea of heroes, as they didn't perceive heroes as we perceive them. For them, heroes were meant to be very arrogant people. They were meant to be very boastful people. They were meant to be ruthless and cruel. And all these things made them heroes. So they were not good people at all. And if you think about like the biggest heroes from the Greek myth, you have people like Achilles, who is quite known for his ruthlessness. You have people like Odysseus, who is famous for his cunning, but he's also a very cruel man. He's someone who promises mercy to spies and then kills them, you know. He's someone who's quite interested in just surviving, and he doesn't care if all his men die. He's the only one who survives of all his men. Like in the Odyssey, he's the only one who goes back home. And then you have someone like Agamemnon, Clytemnestra's wife, who is, and I always say this, but he's always described as a hero in the ancient sources, but never as a good man. So if you think about this, and if you apply this kind of notion of heroism to Clytemnestra, you see that she has some of these features. Like she is definitely quite brave. She can be cunning as well. Actually, her name literally means famous for her cunning, which I think is quite interesting. And it's something that I wanted to explore. So when you talk about, you know, her place in the world, she should be a heroine, but she isn't seen as a heroine just because she's a woman, which I think is quite fascinating. And even the idea of vengeance, that she's a vengeful character, that she's a vengeful woman. You know, vengeance was not a negative thing in ancient Greece, specifically in the Greek heroic age. Vengeance and justice were the same thing. For us, they're opposite things, but they were one and the same. Vengeance was kind of a duty that sons had to like carry out for their fathers. And Clytemnestra is like that. She takes her role. Sometimes she does think of herself not necessarily as a man, but she perceives herself as a free woman. So I definitely wanted to show that she is a heroine, both because she is definitely better than her male counterparts, but also because she does embody some of those same qualities that make men heroes. And I also really like this idea of the contrast between how she grows up and how she is later in life, because like almost the first half of the novel is set in Sparta. And in Sparta, women, they were not necessarily free, but they grew up kind of training, hunting, fighting. They were educated, and they thought of themselves as like free citizens in a way. And so Clytemnestra grows up with that mindset. And I like this idea of showing how later on she encounters a world that does not think her worthy, that does not think her free in a way. And I just wanted to see how she doesn't just survive, but rather keeps fighting because she has that sort of confidence inside of herself.
A lot of ancient Greek mythology, especially modern adaptations and like screen adaptations as well, it's always the men being centered. They're always at the forefront of the narrative. It's never the women. And, you know, you've not denied that there are powerful men in ancient Greece. You know, you've not denied them their stories within this. I loved the way that you explored how the way Clytemnestra and her family were brought up as these free citizens, and they're trained. And I think that definitely gives you a sense of the kind of woman that she grows into. You understand her a lot better from seeing that. So I really liked that you, like I said before, that you tracked it throughout her ages.
But I love that you mentioned the kind of the childhood period and the whole idea of like siblings. And because I also wrote this as a family saga in a way. I really wanted to explore the relationship between the siblings because, well, Castor and Polydeuces, no one really talks about them, and they're quite charming, interesting characters. But I also really wanted to write a novel about sisterhood because I think there aren't enough novels about that. There are some great ones. I'm thinking, you know, Best of Friends like Kamila, Shamsie, or one of my favorites, My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, or The Wolf Den. You know, there are some absolutely great novels about sisterhood and friendship, but not enough, I think. And it's also really hard to write about female friendship in a way that feels honest and raw and visceral, I think sometimes. So I knew, like, as soon as I started writing the novel, that this was also going to be a novel about the relationship between Helen and Clytemnestra, with Clytemnestra being the main character, obviously. But I knew I had to write about Helen, and I knew that I wanted a relationship that was never predictable, that was always multifaceted in a way, and a relationship where there was love and obsession and just jealousy sometimes. And I think most of the times that their relationship is portrayed in a way that doesn't quite work for me, in the sense that Helen is obviously the most beautiful woman in the world. She's the face that launched 1,000 ships. And because of that, people just kind of assumed that Clytemnestra was jealous of her. Mm-hmm. But actually in Sparta, strength was the thing that was valued rather than beauty. And so it was just really interesting for me to kind of turn that around. And also with writing about friendship and sisterhood came the challenge of writing about Helen specifically, because Helen is the most famous, I think she is the most famous female character from the Greek myth. She's been portrayed countless times, but she always feels kind of slippery, I would say. She's always quite hard to pin down. Mm-hmm. Her kind of childhood is very confusing. Her relationship with men like Paris and Mellors, they're quite hard to pin down again. And so for me, it was really about getting Helen right and making sure that she was like a character that was fully fleshed out. And then the sisterhood part came later on, if that makes sense.
Yes. There is such a detailed like family tree. And I imagine it was really hard to create this cast of characters. And like you said, like flesh out each character. Like what was the process like for having to flesh out such a huge cast of characters and this huge family tree? What was the process like?
I think the challenge there was, on the one side, there were characters that was writing that are not really famous. So I had a lot of freedom with them. So for instance, Clytemnestra's younger sister, Timandra, she is just a passing mention in the ancient Greek sources. She appears in this kind of poetry fragment by Stesichorus, who talks about a prophecy, which features in my novel. He says that the daughters of Leda were kind of destined, they were cursed to marry twice and thrice, and that they will all be deserters of the lawful husbands. And that's how Timandra is mentioned. And that's all that we have on her. And so with her, I just could explore a whole kind of subplot completely with a lot of freedom. But then the big challenge for most of the characters, I would say, was writing characters who are really famous. So Helen, we've mentioned her before, but then we have Odysseus, we have Penelope. And obviously when you write about characters who are really famous, you already know that there will be a lot of people who expect them to be a certain way. And I think I wanted them to write in a way that paid homage to the sources, but that also felt fresh and entertaining. And this applies to the narrative as well, by the way, because obviously some people already knew what was going to happen. Some people already know how the story ends. And so I had to make it fresh and entertaining. And so I kept asking myself, how do I make sure that the reader keeps turning the pages? And I think for me, the answer to that was to just go back to the sources and focusing on just tiny details or tiny lines that usually go unnoticed. Just to give an example, in terms of Helen and how I created her character, she appears in a lot of different ancient Greek plays, but two of the most famous ones are Helen by Euripides and the Trojan Women. And in the play Helen, there are a couple of lines that really inspired me specifically. They helped me to create a kind of younger version of Helen. At some point, Helen in the play says, "All my life, people called me Teras," and Teras is the ancient Greek word for both portent and freak, kind of wonder and monster. And I just really, really like this idea of a Helen that was bullied even in her childhood. And I was just really interested in exploring how that must have affected her. Because we know that Helen has been hated her entire life. Whenever people speak of Helen, she's always the woman who kind of caused destruction and killed all those men with her beauty, you know. But going back to what happened to her in her childhood, so that line was very important for me. It just made me think about a girl who was very frustrated, who was very sad and just very lonely. And then there's another line when she talks about her mother and the god Zeus. She says, "The god Zeus tricked my mother into bed." And so I won't go into detail here because that would be a spoiler for the novel, but I was just really interested in how the rumors around her birth affected her. And then for like the older Helen, I used like other tiny mentions and also a fantastic speech that she gives in the Trojan Women. Because I think, you know, you were saying that most of the times with these retellings and in later representations, it's always about the men, which is absolutely true. But what's really interesting is that if you go back to the ancient texts, the women were really important. You know, they had huge storylines. It's just that throughout time, we just kind of forgot about them. And in this play, in the Trojan Women, Helen at some point has this extraordinary speech, which sounds almost like a legal defense. It's a moment when the women of Troy, who are now kind of captives after they have lost the war, they try to convince Helen's husband Menelaus to kill Helen. They say, "Just kill your wife, because wherever she looks, she just brings death and destruction." And so Menelaus goes to Helen and he's like, "Well, here I am, ready to kill you." And I'm paraphrasing, by the way, that's not how it goes. And Helen starts talking, and she is the cleverest character you could ever encounter. If you take that play and the Agamemnon by Aeschylus, you really see how Helen and Clytemnestra were sisters. And she gives a list of all the reasons why she did not cause the war. She starts accusing Menelaus of leaving her alone with a stranger, with a foreigner in her palace. She accuses the queen of Troy, now a slave, for giving birth to Paris, even though she knew that he would bring destruction upon her city. She's incredibly clever, incredibly articulate. And by the end, Menelaus, he doesn't know what to say. He just goes like, "Okay, I will not kill you. I will deal with you later." And we all know that actually he will not kill her. And so in terms of creating a large cast of characters, I think it was kind of finding a balance between very famous characters and just dealing with them and just writing them in a way that felt familiar, but also quite fresh. And then exploring lesser known characters, I would say.
It's such a fascinating book. It really is. And I think, especially with Helen, like seeing some of quite a bit of what she goes through herself, it's quite brutal. And there is kind of like a lot of brutality in the novel. There are some scenes that are, and without spoilers, are absolutely breathtakingly traumatic. It kills you. It really does. And some of that brutality, I think, is indicative of the time it was made, time it's set, of course. That's part of Spartan life as well. But what was it like for you as a writer, creating and forming these really brutal moments and kind of thinking, how much do I do? How far do I go? How far can I push it?
I love this question. That's a great question. It's also a very important one, I think. So I knew that the book was going to be quite a brutal book because Clytemnestra's story is inherently brutal. It's a story, you know, about a woman killing her husband, about a father killing his own child. And this is not really a spoiler because that's how the story goes. So yeah, I will not give any more spoilers here. So I knew I had to kind of incorporate that brutality and in order to really make sure that the word felt real and so that the readers could just immerse themselves into this experience. But I also didn't want to write a book that was just felt hopeless or just traumatic thing after traumatic thing keeps happening. And I knew I had to find some sort of hope. And the hope for me came with the character of Clytemnestra herself, because she doesn't just survive. As I said before, she keeps fighting back with everything horrible that happens to her. She just keeps fighting back. And for me, just writing it felt really inspiring. I don't know, I gained a lot of confidence from writing about this character, and it felt really empowering. And so I think my hope was that it could be an empowering experience for readers as well as they go through the novel. But in terms of like research researching the brutality specifically. I think I did a lot of research into the Spartan word, both in terms of like practical research. So, researching things like how was their training? What did they do when they went out to hunt? Did they have races? That sort of thing. But also kind of, I did a lot of cultural research. So what I kind of call cultural research, which is just asking myself questions such as, how did they perceive death? Were they scared of death? What was their perception of love? How did they think of shame? Those sort of things. And that allowed me to recreate that brutality in a way, while also just keeping my distance from it in a way. Because obviously you're a modern writer. And I think the interesting thing about the myth, the Greek myth specifically, is that, well, any myth really, is that they operate on different timelines. You have the timeline in which they're first kind of told, and then every time they're retold, they operate differently. And so I think it's just a very interesting experience to rewrite an ancient myth for a modern audience, because you're operating on two different levels. You're just recreating that word, but also you're making sure that it appeals to a modern audience, that it is clear, that the way in which that word works is clear for a modern reader.
One of my favorite, there's many things about Clytemnestra that were my favorite, so I can't just say one of my favorite things. There were many, but one of my favorite things about Clytemnestra and the way you wrote Clytemnestra is how sort of unapologetic her rage was. And as Lydia was saying, like, there are parts in the book, without giving any spoilers, there are parts in the book that are really brutal, and her rage is something that sort of powers her on, no matter how much grief she endures and how much suffering she endures, that rage is the thing that sort of drives her. What did you feel, what was the role that female rage played in the novel for you?
Played a huge role, and I wanted it to play a huge role, because I think that as a society we're not still completely comfortable with female rage. We're not comfortable talking about not just female rage or vengeance, but also female ambition and female power, which is why I wanted to write about them through the perspective, following the perspective of an ancient character. This idea of having a main character who was very angry and very vengeful, but also making sure that readers would not really like her. I like her. I think she's amazing, but I didn't want to make her likable, because I think that would have been just a mistake. You should not concern yourself with making your female character likable, because then you're just like destroying feminism. But rather they would root for her. Like, the idea of having readers rooting for her is quite hard if you think about it, because I know so many people like in my life who read books and just don't like the female characters. There's this idea that no matter what women do, they just can't be likable, which is why you should never strive for likability, because it's just unattainable anyways. But I think there was a big challenge there, writing a very angry character and making sure that she would appeal to readers. So I think my way of fixing that was just to, as you said, she's unapologetic, and that's her kind of gift in a way, the fact that she does not care about other people's opinions. And that to me is always something likable. People who are very confident, as they always kind of exude some sort of likability in a way. And so I did not make that up. She's like that in the ancient sources as well. She, in the Agamemnon, after killing her husband, rather than hiding or running away, she goes back on stage and she has this amazing speech where she says, "I brooded on this trial, this ancient blood feud, year by year. At last my hour came. Here I stand and here I struck, and here my work is done." And she says this in front of the whole city. She thinks herself heroic, which I think is just incredibly inspiring. Yeah, I was just, yes, girl, yes, queen.
Yeah, no, but that is it.
Fangirling over my own character. But again, it's also a very kind of interesting idea to explore for a modern audience, just challenging readers and asking them, are you going to root for this woman who is incredibly angry, who's incredibly vengeful, but who has endured like the most horrifying things?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we do have some, that's just afterthought, but I think we are getting used to this more and more. I think there are some books now with characters who are quite vengeful. I think Animal by Liza Taddeo, even in like contemporary fiction, Animal by Liza Taddeo, or like any Gillian Flynn novel, Gone Girl is probably like, you could read it as a revenge narrative. So I think we are kind of getting used to this idea. But there are still people who think that writing books with vengeful characters at the core is not feminist. I do not agree with that at all. I think feminism is really, it's not just about equality, but it's also about allowing women to be whatever they want to be. It's allowing women to be as flawed, as multifaceted, as complex as the men are usually allowed to be. And so if we have more characters that that are flawed, more female characters that are flawed. I think that's just gonna teach us something rather than, it's not misogynist at all.
No,
absolutely.
Well, no, 100%. I completely agree with you. And what I loved about Clytemnestra was how you subverted so many of the stereotypes that we have about women in fiction, particularly. And, my question again is about female rage as well, but particularly focusing on that subversion of she's not a weeping mess. She goes through this horrendous experience, but she never sits there and becomes this weeping, crumpled mess, which is what I think a lot of the time we're told that women should become. You should show your grief like you are a properly crying in the corner and weeping and mourning and all of this stuff. Whereas I feel like Clytemnestra, she's angry and she's sad about it, and she's going to be angry and she's not going to let go of the rage. And I think that it's just such a brilliant portrayal of that characteristic. And I cannot compliment you enough on making this wonderful person come to life, because it's a book I will be giving my daughter as soon as she's old enough. This is a book that teenage girls, we should be getting these teenage girls to read this, because if I'd have read this when I was 16, boy, would I have made some different choices. It gives,
I hope in a better way.
Oh yeah,
going around killing your boyfriend. I'm
not planning on killing my husband, but there are definite parts of that where I'm like, what?
We're not condoning murder here.
Maybe a little bit. It depends on what's happening.
Depends, yeah. Well, next question. No, I'm kidding. I agree completely. And I think, there's nothing wrong with female characters who are weeping. I think the most important thing is just not putting female characters in a box, and just, that there is a character who weeps, and not in my novel, but you have some characters who are weeping and your other characters who are vengeful. And I think you need to have this kind of whole range of reactions to trauma and to grief. And with Clytemnestra specifically, I think I had a couple of people who were asking me, they were not criticizing the novel at all. They were just interested in why I made her so vengeful. And my answer was that she's vengeful. That's the story. Obviously, I did explore that whole side as much as I could, but that was the starting point for me. I never thought of her as anything else, because she is someone who deals with her trauma by just seeking out vengeance, and that is the story. So there was no other Clytemnestra. The Clytemnestra that I had in my mind was vengeful. She was angry. She was very strong, but she was also a passionate character. And I was saying this before, she was also a very generous woman. And I think one of my favorite scenes to write actually happens in the first part of the novel. It's quite hard to describe this without giving any spoilers for people who haven't read the novel. But so Clytemnestra has grown up kind of protecting her sisters. Like everything she has done, she has been a very protective sister, just in relation to Helen, but also in relation to her younger sister, Timandra. And the first time that Clytemnestra is really hurt, her sisters are not there, and they kind of run and they try to save her, but it is too late. And Timandra specifically, there is a scene from her perspective while all this happens, and one of the last lines that she has is, as soon as she realizes that her sister Clytemnestra is getting hurt and that she's not there, she says, actually let me see if I can find it, because it's actually, I just love this scene so much.
Please.
Okay, here you go. She says, okay, so I'll just start reading from here without giving any spoilers. So she realizes her sister is being hurt, and she said, tears stream down her cheeks and blind her. It is the first time she's frightened for someone else, not only for herself. The feeling makes her choke. And it's this idea that rather than telling you something about Timandra, I think this tells you something about Clytemnestra and what an amazing sister she was, up to this point. Because I think you don't really realize how special something is or someone is until she's just not there. And for the first time, Timandra has to care for her sister, but she can't. And she realizes how important and how special Clytemnestra has been in her life. So I think we have described her as cruel, sometimes as cunning, as vengeful, but she's also all these things. She's also an amazing sister, just a very protective mother. She's also kind of a very fierce ruler. And I think it's important to highlight those things as well.
I think it's beautiful because, she fiercely loves her family. And with a lot of historical figures, with men, if they kill because they fiercely love somebody, it's admirable. But if a woman does the same thing, it's like you said before, she comes across as mad, or, she's portrayed in a really negative way. way. And it's like, you know, male characters historically have always been allowed sort of like a grey area in terms of morality, whereas women haven't been sort of allowed the same. And I really liked, like Lydia said before, the way that you've sort of subverted these things and you've flipped the narrative of that, and you've allowed for this female rage, for female ambition and power and desire as well. You know, you've explored all of these.
That is true. That is
Please talk about that, because I loved the way you explored female desire.
No, I mean, it is quite a big part of the book because Clytemnestra has quite a few lovers in the novel.
Yes.
Most of them taken from the actual myth. One made up. The character Leon, he does not exist in the myth. I made him up. But I was interested in two things. First, talking about female desire, writing about female desire in the ancient world, because I think in contemporary fiction, now we have so many brilliant novels to do that. But sometimes with historical fiction, it's not a theme that's quite common. I mean, there are some great novels about it, but not enough, I would say. But I was also interested in writing a cast of male characters who were quite different from one another, because I don't think that when you write a feminist retelling, you just have to have cruel men in it. I think it is quite interesting to explore how different men can be. So you have someone like Agamemnon, who is the worst, and he's horrible, he's incredibly cruel, but he's also quite powerful. And with him, I was interested in seeing like where his power came from, why he became the leader of the Greek forces during the Trojan War. And then you have someone like Clytemnestra's first husband, Tantalus, who he does appear in a source as like a passing mention, but I kind of created his character. Like I made sure that he was like fully fleshed out. And I was really interested in him because he embodies like a different kind of life. For Clytemnestra, she has grown up in Sparta. She doesn't really know pleasure. She's just used to pain in a way. The pain is her way of life. Vengeance has been her way of life. War is her way of life. And then she meets Tantalus, who is a foreigner. And the ancient Greeks were incredibly racist. They, like any person who was not Greek, they just called him like a foreigner. They had this like very narrow idea of what like a brave person was supposed to be. And then Tantalus arrives, and he is a good person. He is brave, but he's also gentle, he's generous, and he's loving. And Clytemnestra doesn't really know what this means. She's kind of scared at first. And obviously, like all those qualities do not make him a hero in the Greek heroic age, which is why he is not respected by someone like Clytemnestra's father or by Agamemnon. But Clytemnestra can see the good in him, and she is kind of attracted. She's really fascinated by him. And I think he is kind of her first encounter with female pleasure. But I think specifically talking about female desire, I think the most interesting character for me to write was her lover later on in Mycenae, who is Aegisthus. He is a very famous character in the myth, actually, but he's always described as this kind of disgusting, creepy creature, just a treacherous kind of man. And I always thought, well, Clytemnestra falls for him, surely. He must have been charming in some way. And he's someone who has endured just the worst. And I was interested in, yes, female desire on the one side, but also how broken people kind of find solace in each other and how they can survive in a way. So it was just, for me, it was a mixture of writing about desire and writing about how broken people keep living in a way. And those two things came together. But I also like the idea of writing about a character who takes the initiative all the time, because that's who Clytemnestra is. And that's what she does with her first husband and then with her lover. And I just really enjoy writing about that, because I just love books with characters like that. I love reading books like that. So I just wanted to have that in my own novel as well. And I feel like it's perfect for someone like Clytemnestra. She is someone who takes the initiative. So
100%. Yes. She's not waiting for anyone. She's just doing it. I love her.
Yeah,
I love
too.
her, and I have absolutely loved the book, and I cannot tell you how much I've been recommending it to everybody that I know. I will be forcing it down everybody's throat until until
hopefully they will want to read it.
I don't care about one.
It's a dictatorship.
Yeah, that's it. I'm a Spartan woman now.
What have you done, Costanza? What
I
have
know,
you
I'm
done?
going for it now.
You created a monster.
Sorry.
I love it. Thank you guys.
Finally, I just wanted to ask you one last quick question, and that was, why do you feel like these stories need to be retold and kept alive for future generations?
Oh, that's a great question, and I have so many answers to that. I will try to give
A little one.
I love that you said one last question. I was like, oh, this is a big one. Okay. Well, first of all, we have said this before, we've talked about this a little bit, but these stories, these characters, some of these characters are incredibly modern. And so when you write about them, it allows you to explore so many modern themes like female desire and ambition and vengeance and how women are perceived when they're powerful and when they're ambitious, that sort of thing. I also think that when we are rewriting the stories, we are paying homage to the concept of myth as the ancient Greeks intended it, because myth in ancient Greece was never something fixed. It was constantly changing, constantly evolving. Each myth had so many different versions of it. Just take, Helen's story. According to some versions, she escaped with Paris willingly. According to other stories, she was kidnapped and just brought to Troy against her will. There is yet another version that says that actually she never went to Troy at all, but actually was shipped off to Egypt while her ghost went to Troy. So when we're, rewriting the stories, again, we're just doing something that the Greeks themselves are already doing it. But I also like the idea, and I've talked about this in a couple of events. I just love thinking about the idea of the word myth, which in ancient Greek is mythos. It means fact, fiction, story, any story transmitted by a word of mouth, legend, but it also means like public speech. And it is used for the first time in the Odyssey, in like the first book of the Odyssey, when Penelope, Odysseus' wife, and Clytemnestra's husband walks into the great hall and there's a bard singing a song. She doesn't really like the song he's singing. It stresses her out. And so she asks him to sing another song. But she's then interrupted by her own son, Telemachus, who says, "Shut up, mother." Again, this is me paraphrasing. "Shut up, mother. Go back to your rooms. Go back to your weaving. Speech will belong to the men." And the word he uses is mythos. So I think when we are rewriting the stories, we're actually reclaiming this. We are reclaiming this power, the power of public speech. And it's an incredibly crucial thing to do, I think. And this idea that there are so many female writers now, so many women writers now rewriting these myths is no coincidence, I think. I love the sound you made. You were like,
I just want to have your brain just for a day. I feel like it would.
Don't say that. Your brain is perfect.
But I'm very sad that is all we've got time for. But before we let you go, I mean, I read before that you've been a producer and you've written for television. Is there any plans in the works for a Clytemnestra adaptation?
Not yet, but fingers crossed. Keep your fingers crossed for this one.
Oh, I'm keeping everything crossed, and we're both actors, so
I'm just saying when she's about in the 30 years old bracket, someone right here ready.
Do you want to play Helen?
Clytemnestra is my dream
You're
role.
You're a Clytemnestra.
Yeah, it's all right. I'll take Helen. I've got a face that looks 1,000 ships.
Helen is a great character.
Yes. I think it's said though that Clytemnestra is tall at some point. Did I read that character description?
Yeah, I think she's tall. It doesn't matter.
I read something somewhere and I was like, oh, I don't match up to that, but I'm just going to ignore that and I am going to be Clytemnestra.
That's okay. As long as you're fierce, that's all
I can be fierce. I am fierce. I can do that. And before we let you go, to finish off our debut episodes, we've been asking for your recommendations for other debut authors that you'd like to recommend to our listeners. So can you give us some?
Of course. So I have 4 recommendations.
Gorgeous.
First,
love it. You can come back.
Yeah. Well, I actually have more, but I'll try to summarize. So I think my first is going to be River Sing Me Home.
Yes, Elena. Yes, amazing.
She's amazing. Her book is amazing. I think she often says that it's not a book about slavery, but what comes after slavery. And I think that's the perfect description. Just gorgeous writing, amazing character, and it is a book. Yes, it is partly about slavery, but it's a very hopeful book. And that's just the best part for me. My other recommendation is Talking at Night by Claire Davalry. This is going to be published by Penguin Michael Joseph, my publisher, this summer. I did an event with Claire at Cheltenham last year, and the book is going to be compared to Sally Rooney, but I don't think that's the right comparison. I think it's perfect for people who enjoy David Nichols. So this is like a one-day kind of novel, and it's amazing, beautiful writing, and just it's a very heartbreaking story.
Oh, I'm ready for it.
Yes. So Talking at Night, River Sing Me Home. I've also read Dazzling by Chikodili Melumadu.
Yes.
It's a gorgeous book with a lot of magical elements woven into the story. I love magical realism in novels, and I think that just works perfectly. And Chikodili has the most unique voice. It's just so good. And then my fourth recommendation, I think for people who enjoyed Clytemnestra, I would probably read Lady Macbeth by Isabel Schuller. I did an event with Isabel recently in Norwich. She's great. And her novel it's just an origin story of Lady Macbeth as a character. And it just, again, very entertaining, gorgeous writing. And you have this like villainess that you just end up rooting for, and it's just great. So yeah, those four are going to be my recommendation. I have many more, but yeah, I'll contain myself.
I am so sold on all of those.
Yeah.
And I think I'll take any recommendation from you from here on out, because you've given us a cracking list.
Thank you, guys.
Yes, we're going to have you back every month. I'm joking.
It's done. Part of my contract now.
Yes. But we do fully expect you back for the next book. Do we have something to look forward to?
Yes, I'm almost done with the first draft of my next novel, but I'm not allowed to talk about it. Otherwise, it murders me. But I think there will be an announcement soon.
Gorgeous. Well, that is music to my ears. I'm so excited. And we're having you back for the next one. You've already agreed. You already said so.
Yes, I would love to be back. Yes, please.
Amazing. Can our listeners find you on social media?
You can, yes. So I am on Instagram and Twitter. I'm on TikTok as well, but I don't use it, so don't go there. Both on Instagram and Twitter is just my name and surname. So Costanza Casati.
Beautiful. And listeners, please do go and buy Clytemnestra if you haven't already. It is a phenomenal book and already one of my favorite reads of the year. So yeah, I just absolutely insist that you all go and buy it, and go give Costanza a follow, because she's amazing, as you will have already heard in this episode. And if you did enjoy this episode, please don't forget to rate, review and subscribe, as it helps us to reach other listeners and other readers. And if you would like to give us a follow, you can do so at Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and Out of Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. Lydia, any last words?
I just love you. I love you so much, Costanza.
Guys, one of my favorite.
We love you
ever. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for
you are amazing. Yes, we absolutely love you and cannot wait to see what else you do. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us today, Costanza. And goodbye.
Bye.